All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're breaking down a totally fascinating critique of the recent film Durandar 2. But we're not actually looking at this as just a movie. Instead, the source material we're digging into today deconstructs the film as a highly calculated psychological tool. According to this critique, the whole thing is meticulously engineered to shape public perception. And honestly, understanding the mechanics behind how it does that, well, it's an absolute masterclass in modern media literacy.
Okay, so the source immediately hits us with this incredibly provocative hook. It argues that Durandar 2 is not actually entertainment at all. It's described as the world's most expensive political advertisement, and the kicker? Audiences are actually paying 500 rupees just to sit and watch it. The analysis points out something crucial here. Unlike a YouTube ad that you can just skip after 5 seconds, this is a totally captive experience. I mean, think about the psychological weight of that for a second. You're sitting in a dark theater, you're fully immersed, and your guard is completely down. And to really back up this claim, the source notes that prominent political figures, like the Chief Minister of Assam, have publicly endorsed the film, openly stating that watching it will motivate people to vote for the ruling party.
Section 1. The Legal Cheat Code. So you might be wondering, how exactly does a film manage to function as a political campaign without facing any regulatory hurdles? Well, we've all seen this classic disclaimer, right? A fictional work inspired by real events. But our source argues that in this case, it's being used as a deliberate shield. The film uses real, highly recognizable political figures like the Prime Minister and real-world gangsters like Dawood Abraham, yet it hides behind the fine print that any resemblance is purely coincidental. The analysis makes this great comparison. It's like a bottle boldly labeled fresh tomato ketchup, but the tiny fine print on the back admits it's just a brand name and contains absolutely zero real tomatoes. This legal cheat code is what allows the filmmakers to freely blend historical fact with pure fiction, all while completely dodging any accountability for the truth.
Section 2. Psychology of audience manipulation.
Moving past the legal stuff into something much deeper, the source introduces us to the concept of emotional priming. To explain this, the critique uses a pretty brilliant analogy. Imagine a sweet shop owner forcibly feeding you incredibly spicy food, totally burning your tongue, so that you are practically begging to buy their sweets just for some relief. According to the analysis, the film does exactly this. It opens with a brutal, horrific scene of religious violence in Pakistan. But here's the thing. The source argues that this scene has absolutely zero relevance to the film's core plot. It doesn't develop characters, it doesn't advance the storyline. Its sole psychological purpose is just to artificially stoke anger and religious anxiety, priming the audience's emotional state so heavily that they'll just unquestioningly accept the political narrative that follows.
And this brings us to audience manipulation at its absolute peak. The source breaks down a specific sequence where the notorious gangster Dawood Ibrahim is just sitting around praising the Prime Minister's effectiveness. Now, the critique asks us to stop and think about why a filmmaker would do this. It's because praise coming from the ultimate villain is actually way more persuasive than praise coming from a hero. The source compares it to Thanos trembling and saying he's absolutely terrified of Spider-Man. If the biggest, baddest villain in the universe is scared, your brain unconsciously accepts the hero's absolute supremacy. It is a wildly effective persuasion tactic, perfectly disguised as simple dialogue.
Section 3. Rewriting the historical record.
Let's look at how this actively clashes with documented reality. The critique highlights a major plot point in the film, this idea that the United States government actively tried to prevent the current Prime Minister from taking office back in 2014. But the source completely debunks this, using actual historical data. In reality, the U.S. ambassador met with him in Gujarat months prior to the election results even being announced. And on the exact day the results came in, U.S. President Barack Obama personally called to congratulate him and invite him to the White House. The source argues the film conjures up this entirely fictional international conspiracy simply to make the protagonist look like an underdog fighting against the entire world.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The source argues the film completely flips the reality of foreign funding. The movie claims that Pakistan's ISI was pouring dollars into Indian NGOs, universities, and socialists to destabilize the country. But the source pulls up a 2002 report and Al Jazeera data showing that U.S. donors have actually systematically funneled millions into right-wing organizations instead. The analysis claims this fictional plotline was deliberately crafted for a very specific reason, to justify the real-world government crackdown on thousands of civil society groups. We're talking environmental watchdogs and global human rights organizations like Amnesty International. The film paints them as enemies of the state on screen to basically validate real-world policy.
Section 4. The truth about demonetization.
Which brings us to how the film handles a highly controversial economic policy, demonetization. 99.3%. Let that number sink in for a second. According to the Reserve Bank of India data, cited directly in the analysis, this is the percentage of demonetized currency that successfully returned to the banking system. The film tries to reframe the entire demonetization policy as this brilliant national security masterstroke, designed to stop a massive influx of fake currency from Pakistan. But the source uses this 99.3% figure to boldly point out that the overarching premise of a massive financial purge simply doesn't align with the central bank's own historical data.
So when we actually break down the RBI's data from their 2017-2018 report, the film's narrative starts to crumble. The movie invents a narrative that 60,000 crore rupees in fake currency was being pumped into the country, basically forcing the Prime Minister's hand. But the RBI report shows only 43 crore in fake currency was actually detected. The source compares the film's logic here to burning down your entire house just to catch a single rat. While the movie portrays it as a flawless, heroic victory, the critique reminds us of the lived reality. GDP dropped by about 3 percentage points, and there were severe citizen casualties, with people literally collapsing and dying in desperate bank lines. The source argues the film masks this collective trauma with a shiny coat of fictional heroism.
Section 5. The power of omission.
You know, propaganda isn't just about the lies you tell, it's equally about the truths you deliberately choose to hide. The source meticulously maps out a timeline of major, defining events that are entirely erased from the film's universe. For instance, there's absolutely no mention of the Prime Minister's surprise-friendly visit to Pakistan in December 2015, there's no mention of the devastating Pathankot Air Force terror attack that happened just days later, and there is no mention of the tragic 2019 Pulwama attack, which the source notes was actually preceded by 11 ignored intelligence inputs. So why systematically omit these massive events? Well, the critique argues that they contradict the invincible, proactive, error-free image of the product being sold to the audience. In short, they just don't fit the advertisement's brief.
Section 6. Gaslighting and lived memories.
This leads us to arguably the most severe accusation in the entire critique: mass gaslighting. The source accuses the film of deploying the psychological manipulation on a truly grand scale. Look, it's one thing to make a movie that twists the history of 1947. Most of the audience wasn't even alive to witness it. But the critique emphasizes that the events of 2016 to 2023 happened right in front of us. We lived through the panic, we stood in those endless ATM lines, we watched the news coverage unfold in real time. By insisting that those lived memories are somehow wrong and that the film's fictionalized, sanitized version is the actual truth, the source argues the movie forcefully crosses the line from mere fiction into profound psychological manipulation. To really hammer this gaslighting effect home, the source looks at a highly specific and very recent example. The film portrays the 2023 killing of a character based on gangster Atiq Ahmed as this brilliant, clean intelligence operation watched live by a highly frustrated Pakistani ISI major. But let's look at the grim reality provided by the critique. Atiq Ahmed was murdered by civilians on live television while entirely in police custody. It was widely criticized as a massive law and order failure. In fact, the Indian Parliament officially observed a moment of silence for him. And to top it all off, the real-life ISI major the film depicts intensely watching this unfold in 2023, yeah, he actually died in 2011. The source argues this messy, uncomfortable reality was completely distorted just to fit a political client brief.
So what does this all mean? The analysis leaves us with this really stark warning. When gaslighting happens on a massive scale, displayed on giant screens to millions of people under the guise of casual weekend entertainment, it absolutely ceases to be just a movie. The critique challenges us to ask ourselves whenever we consume media, are you watching cinema or are you paying for a political weapon? It's definitely something to keep in mind the next time you see the words inspired by true events. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive in today's Explainer.